U.S. President Donald Trump wants to end the war in Ukraine, and today it looks like his patience with the man who started it is wearing thin. For the first time since his return to the White House in January, the president is imposing direct sanctions on Russia. They target the country's two largest oil companies. Trump announced the measures after he hosted NATO chief Mark Rutte for talks on how to support Ukraine.
Sitting alongside the NATO chief, Donald Trump said the U.S. is taking aim at one of Moscow's biggest sources of income.
Today is a very big day in terms of what we're doing. Look, these are tremendous sanctions. These are very big. Those are against their two big oil companies. And we hope that they won't be on for long. We hope that the war will be settled.
The United States is sanctioning Rosneft and Lukoil, two of Russia's largest oil companies. For Moscow, oil and gas remain the single most important source of federal revenue, supplying around 30% of the state budget. U.S. sanctions effectively ban all business with Rosneft, Lukoil, and their subsidiaries, not just for American companies, but also for foreign banks and partners linked to them. Measures that NATO chief Rutte welcomes.
I think most of you were in the Oval Office, but I'm absolutely convinced that with sustained pressure, we will be able to get Putin to the table to agree with a ceasefire and then other talks coming after that. And you have seen it in the last couple of weeks. Alaska happened when the American president decided to do secondary sanctions on India buying Russian oil. We have seen last week the call taking place when the president said, I'm contemplating sending Tomahawks into Ukraine, for Ukraine to be used. So this is clear evidence that we can change Putin's calculus. I now really have to go.
A show of unity for NATO and a signal that Western resolve against Russia's war remains firm.
Well, India is reportedly gearing up to make massive cuts in crude imports from its biggest supplier, Russia, because of sanctions from the U.S. and Europe. Citing industry sources, news agencies said flows of Russian oil to major Indian processors are expected to fall to near zero after U.S. sanctions on crude giants Rosneft and Lukoil. India is one of the world's largest buyers of Russian energy. For more information, let's go to our DW New Delhi Bureau Chief, Sandra Petersman. Sandra, what more do we know at this point?
I mean, if true, this would potentially really hit India very hard. There's still a little bit of time for Indian refiners to think how to come to terms with these new sanctions issued by the United States, because the enforcement, the deadline for enforcement is November 27th. But if true, you have to look at what this means for India. And currently, India is importing about 30%, more than 30% of its crude from Russia. And if they have to cut back that massively, or even if some agencies are claiming to zero, it would mean that oil prices here in India would probably rise. And that is not good news for the Modi government and neither for the people of India.
Yeah. What would it mean for India's economy? Where else could they turn for oil if they were to implement these drastic cuts to Russian oil that are being reported?
Let's perhaps look at history here, Nicole. Before Russia's full invasion of Ukraine, so before 2022, India only imported below 1% of its oil imports from Russia. And then with the full invasion and the sanction packages hitting India and the price cap that was introduced on Russian oil, it made Russian oil very cheap. And then India, like China, really cashed in. And from below 1%, the imports went up to over 30%. And this is where we are at right now, roughly 35%. So to replace that, India would have to go back to other sources, as they did before 2022, countries like Saudi Arabia, countries like Iraq, the Emirates. But that, of course, might mean that they have to pay more, because Russian oil, as it stands, is cheap because the price is capped.
That was DW New Delhi Bureau Chief Sandra Petersman. Thanks.